Who's ever been, like one example, who's ever been on a night out and then you wake up the next day and you're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? What have I done? And I know alcohol sometimes has a bit of a thing in this, but that's when you let your ego get completely out of control, and you wake up the next day and you're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? What have I done? But if you'd actually thought about those, if you'd actually thought about what you were doing before you did it, you wouldn't have done it, would you? So if you'd actually taken some time out to think, is this a good idea? Your thinking brain would have probably said, no, that's not a very good idea. But your ego and some of the other things at play, because there will be other things at play as well, will say, this is a really good idea because I'm going to do this. This is going to do this, and that's what I'm going to do. And that is ego. It's primitive and it's instinctive, and it is playing out in your mind, and it's making you feel superior, and it justifies all your behaviours, and it turns you into a victim, and it lowers your mood. Explain it in a way that makes sense, but it's quite, I've sort of been listening about this week about ego, and your ego, even though it's a good thing, it can really have a negative impact. So we need to know, we need to be aware of our ego, and we need to be aware that it's there, and we need to know that sometimes what we're doing, if we actually thought about what we were doing, we wouldn't do it. But your brain, your thinking brain, does not automatically the first thing that goes into play. Your thinking brain is sort of comes in second. So your ego and everything like that, what your subconscious thinking, your ego, that will all go out in the ethos. Yeah, ego. So your thinking brain needs to go into play before your ego. And I'm not saying this will happen all the time. I'm not saying like you're going to think, but with time and with practice, your ego will be controlled. You will control your ego, and you won't make automatic reactions. But I just wanted to explain some of the times when your ego is going first, is taking charge, and it's usually in them situations where after, like, has anyone had an argument with somebody and then afterwards you feel like, I really regret that, like, why did that get to where it got? It's because you were both playing out your egos. You were both not wanting to back down. You were both not wanting to think of another way out. You were right, they were right, and you were both clashing to each other, and you were both yeah, thanks Jonathan. Yes, I hate arguing. That, like, I'm not saying you can't not argue, because it's like something that you have, sometimes you have to have an argument, but when you know the times when it gets out of control and everyone's both crying, and like I've been there, and then afterwards you're like, why did that happen? It's because one of you could have just backed down and said, right, this isn't getting us anywhere. Let's think about this. Let's move forward. Let's see where we so there, the ego. When you're arguing and you're all crying, that's because both your egos have gone like that together. And you're natural, when you're both clashing and you're having an argument, you are naturally thinking, this sounds really, really extreme. It sounds extreme. But you're thinking, oh my gosh, if I don't win this argument, I'm going to die. And that sounds really extreme, but that is what your ego is doing. Your ego has gone through this whole, it's gone through a millisecond of all this thinking, like that. And you're on the other end, and at the other end you're like, if I don't win this argument, I'm going to die. And that is literally what's playing out. So now you can understand why sometimes when you're in that moment you can't back down. But let's think of it, in reality, in today's day and age, is that going to be the outcome? Probably not. Like, is this making ego? I have got a massive ego. My ego does not want to back down. My ego is taking charge of everything. And the amount of regrettable decisions I've made through my ego, if I just said to my ego, shut up, just shut up a minute, I'm in charge here and I'm going to take control. It's part of your identity. Your ego is part of your identity. No matter what you do, you've got an identity. Your ego is always part of it. It's a natural thing. We can't cut it out and throw it, because in the right circumstances, your ego is needed and required. But we can take charge of it. And once you start taking charge of your ego, life will completely change. Like sometimes when you do like mindset, you're taking charge of that ego and you don't even know that you're taking charge of that ego. And